Some of the most difficult days for me to preach during the years as a Baptist pastor were those Sundays associated with holidays such as Memorial Day. I often reflected on the question of how do we honor Americans who fought and died in the armed services of our country without glorifying war. As some of you know, I have struggled at being a pacifist. It's been a long journey for me. I joined the Navy right out of high school. It wasn't that I was very patriotic, I just needed the fastest way to get out of my parents' home. I wasn't ready or properly motivated to go to college at the time, and menial jobs just weren't cutting it. About 2 years into my 4-year hitch, I knew what I did not want to do for the rest of my life, and I knew that I was then quite ready to go back to school. 2 years later, when I finally got to college, I began to explore the various ways that the United States have used their military over the years and the lies that were told to the American people so that they would support our involvement in these engagements. From Remember the Maine, to the Gulf of Tonkin, to the supposedly endangered U.S. students on that tiny island, Grenada, to the lies about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, our government manipulated and cajoled public sentiment to support these wars of choice. Truth be told, our nation, which we're told stands for peace and freedom, has only 2 years that we have not been involved in an armed conflict somewhere around the globe since World War II. I was learning that war, with all of its attending death and destruction, was the ultimate statement of human hubris and the admission of political failure. As I struggled with this, I was lucky enough to come across a few little-known stories that answered that question and offered me a paradigm in which to move forward as a pacifist. The following short anecdotes come from a documentary called The Good War and Those Who Refused to Fight It. The setting was World War II, the only war of the 20th century that could be categorized as a just war. Nearly everyone living in the United States supported our entrance into this war after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. It was a Herculean effort to destroy the evils of Hitler and Nazism and the imperial ambitions of Japan. There were, however, a notable number of people who stated that they could not bear arms. They claimed a moral objection. They would not kill. They were conscientious objectors, COs, if you will, and as you will hear, they too were heroes in their own right. These included, among others, Seventh-day Adventists, the Amish, the Mennonites, Jehovah's Witnesses, and the Quakers. During the war, those who refused to be drafted were placed in work camps, and they were doing little more than tending gardens and repairing the building they were living in. Eventually, government officials in charge of these COs were persuaded by the arguments of these men who wanted to do something important to support their country during a time of war, albeit without bearing arms. This was a watershed moment for the nation's mental health institutions and medical science. There were 42,000 COs volunteering to be everything from guinea pigs in a variety of medical experiments, ones that would never be allowed today, and also staffing our mental institutions. When it became apparent that many of our military held in prison camps and civilians who were in concentration camps or death camps were nearly starved to death, U.S. medical doctors were searching for the best way to treat the extremely emaciated men and women once they were freed. To this end, hundreds of conscientious objectors volunteered their bodies to be starved while performing rigorous exercise routines. Their bodies wasted away, and some died before they could be nursed back to health by the doctors who were experimenting to find the most effective treatments. Another group of COs were recruited to have themselves injected with hepatitis in hopes that doctors would find an effective cure for the disease. And one of the most far-reaching and important moments was when 3,000 COs replaced workers at the psychiatric hospitals. When they arrived at the hospitals, they found the residents naked and reeking from their own filth. The unruly were strapped to beds or cuffed to radiators. Due to the efforts of these COs to expose the inhumane conditions, a nationwide movement to reform these institutions began, and it changed the treatment of the mentally ill in this country. These were not cowards. They were heroes. But the most remarkable story of a conscientious objector comes to us from the brutal fighting in the Western Pacific. The following story can be found in the documentary The Conscientious Objector, the Desmond Doss story. Water. A few years ago, I was privileged to see on the Disney Channel one of the most remarkable stories of faith in the face of the most severe storm that anyone would ever encounter. This Memorial Day weekend, and it is time to think of heroes and patriotism, and so I would like to share with you this story. Now, many of you have faced storms in your own lives. Maybe an existential battle for your health. Maybe you suffered physical or mental abuse. Maybe financial ruin or the loss of a loved one. I think most of us have faced these types of storms in our lives. So you may be able to empathize with this conscientious objector and hero. As a Seventh-day Adventist, Desmond T. Doss was drafted into the service during the Second World War, yet he refused to carry a gun. He could not justify killing in the face of the Bible's seventh commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." Nevertheless, he was assigned as a medic to a combat unit in the Pacific. His commanding officer was very leery about having a CO in his outfit. He tried to have him kicked out of the military. Members of his own company bullied him. They spit on him, and when he was trying to sleep in the barracks, they threw their shoes at him. His sergeant even threatened to kill him in the first battle they faced. Regardless, Doss stuck to his moral center and persevered. He told his commanding officer that he would dedicate himself to saving lives even while they were taking lives. During the first beach invasion that Desmond Doss participated in, he continuously faced enemy fire to treat and evacuate wounded soldiers on the beach. After a day of fierce fighting, any doubts as to the courage and dedication of this man Doss were swept away by the stories that were repeated over and over again on the hospital ship Mercy. The wounded there, treated by Doss on the beach, recounted his heroism. One of the wounded he treated, his commanding officer, lay in his hospital bed and heard the stories. He could barely believe what he was hearing. Some weeks later, Doss's outfit was among those who invaded Okinawa, the site of some of the most fierce fighting in the Pacific theater. Doss's unit, along with others, inched up a steep embankment to a flat outcropping of rock where they came under fire from previously unseen machine gun nests. His unit was forced off of what was to be known as Hacksaw Ridge. 6 days in a row they tried to take it. Then the command was given. The escarpment was to be taken at all costs. The Japanese were well dug into fortified positions. The hail of bullets was nothing short of murderous. Within 5 minutes, hundreds of men went down, either dead or wounded. The remaining soldiers retreated down the bluff to escape the wall of lead. But Doss could not ignore the cries from the wounded on the ledge. As grenades exploded and lead rained down upon his position, he treated over 75 men who were unable to make their way out of this storm of death and down the cliff. As this storm raged around Doss, and a mightier storm, I dare say, than maybe any individual had experienced, in the midst of this, Doss found the complete peace and tranquility to act on his faith and his religious beliefs. For him, in the storm, all was as calm. The rest of the unit watched in awe from the beach as one by one Doss lowered the wounded down the cliff by rope. All night long he applied bandages, moved his patients to a spot that offered some protection from small arms fire, and while artillery and mortar shells fell close by, he painstakingly administered plasma. Later that night, when an American GI was severely wounded by fire from a cave, PFC Doss crawled to him to where he had fallen, 25 feet from the enemy position. He rendered aid and then carried him 100 yards to safety while continuously exposing himself to enemy fire. He remained in exposed territory while the rest of his company took cover down the cliff, fearlessly taking chance after chance. At first light, his company once again scaled the cliff. This time they drove off the Japanese forces. During the peak of the battle, Doss himself was seriously wounded in the legs by an exploding grenade. But rather than call another medic into the line of fire, he cared for his own injuries and waited 5 hours before the litter bearers could reach him and start carrying him to cover. The trio then was caught in a counterattack, and Private First Class Doss, seeing a more critically wounded man nearby, rolled off his litter and commanded his litter bearers to pick that man up. Awaiting for the litter bearers to return to him, he was struck again, this time suffering a compound fracture of his arm. With magnificent fortitude, he bound a broken rifle stock to his shattered arm as a splint and crawled 300 yards over rough terrain to the aid station. Through his outstanding bravery and unflinching determination in the face of a desperately dangerous situation, PFC Doss lived to see the official record credit him with saving nearly 100 lives in the middle of a storm of all storms, against odds that no betting person would take. 1 year later, the President of the United States awarded Desmond T. Doss the Medal of Honor, the highest award any hero can receive. Most of these medals of honor are awarded to soldiers who have lost their lives in their act of heroism. But Doss, spiritually centered in his life, and a faith that was unswerving in the face of storm of automatic weapon fire, mortars, and tank shells, lived to be the only World War II conscientious objector to be awarded this supreme honor. Desmond Doss became the only wartime hero to receive the Medal of Honor without firing a shot, without taking a life. As Doss said, he made it his business to preserve life, not take it. And I am convinced that he could hear that still, small voice, and it kept him focused in the midst of the raging storm. Someday, maybe our nation will recognize the courage and dedication to this country that these COs have shown and lift them up for praise, as they are worthy of being remembered. The Bible quotes Jesus teaching this: "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God." Amen.